Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening for our friends in Israel. We're so excited to have you joining once again for one of our virtual Israel sessions. We're going to let all of the attendees logging on this morning join into the Zoom webinar. And as soon as we get to the point that we think everybody's in, we'll get started. So once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. We have really an incredible program, incredible guests, and we're very excited for our conversation and for our experience this morning. Probably in about another minute, we'll get going. I know folks will always be joining us in as the time goes on, but we'll get started in just a moment. Once again, want to welcome everybody to the Jewish Federation's Virtual Israel Experience for this Spring 2021 series. This is our 7th Virtual Israel Experience. So just about another 30 seconds, we'll get started. We do have closed captioning enabled for the hearing impaired or those that like to read along. And we'll be using our chat box to provide you resources and information about this program and other programs. So I think most of the folks that have already logged in our Zoom meeting with us. So I'm going to get started this morning. Once again, I want to welcome everybody to a really exciting virtual Israel experience. Of course, we have amazing guests, which we'll get to in a moment. My name is Dan Gold. I work here in Los Angeles at the Jewish Federation. I want to thank you all for joining us. Once again, I want to thank our tour providers, World Express Travel here in Los Angeles, and IGT Tour Company in Israel for putting all of this together and putting all of our virtual Israel sessions together. It's really been a remarkable set of programs. When we are only now are we starting to be able to travel to Israel, and I know many of us are planning our next trip, but for the last year plus we haven't been able to, and these programs have been an incredible opportunity for us to feel connected back to Israel. Once again, really quickly, just want to mention to everybody, if you have any questions for our guests, please utilize the Q&A option on your Zoom window, and then our colleagues on the Zoom will be using the chat box to share resources. To get started this morning, I want to introduce a lay leader with the Jewish Federation. See, Karen Perlmutter is on the screen. Dr. Karen Perlmutter is an award-winning scientist, engineer, filmmaker, publisher, and public speaker. She has published the #1 best-selling autobiography of her father, Dr. Avram Perlmutter, who is a Holocaust survivor who has helped to establish the State of Israel during its 1948 War of Independence. She also created a multi-award-winning documentary about her father and continues to share his life story by speaking to schools and other groups. Karen is a longtime Federation lay leader and is instrumental in helping to strengthen the Federation's partnership with organizations in Israel like the ICEI, who are with us today, of course. She's a member of the Caring for Jews in Need Committee, a cabinet member of the Sylvia Weiss Women's Philanthropy, and is on the JFNA Critical Needs Leadership Council for Holocaust Survivors. We're so grateful for Karen's support and leadership, and is glad she is able to help us introduce our program today. So I'm going to turn it over to Karen to do that introduction.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everyone. The Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles identifies and addresses the greatest challenges, needs, and opportunities facing our community, both locally and globally. The COVID-19 pandemic brought us waves of new challenges and critical needs. In response, we pivoted quickly and dramatically expanded our work, responding to our already and newly at-risk vulnerable populations in Los Angeles and Israel. We amended our program plan quickly so that we could respond in the most strategic manner possible, working intensively with our network of partners. The extensive needs of our Jewish community have not disappeared in 2021. In fact, we are hearing from more community members and are seeing new needs emerge. We expect that the impact of the pandemic will be felt for a long time. As we look ahead to meeting the challenges of what this year brings, we will continue to rely on our community members to be ambassadors of our Federation and to lead by example through their generous support. Throughout 2020, we worked to keep our community involved in Jewish life. We offered extensive virtual programs for young adults and families with young children and created virtual Israel trip experiences like our program today to keep our community connected to our homeland. In fact, today's program is among a series of virtual Israel trip programs this spring that follow our whole lineup of incredible tours and conversations from the summer. But today's program is extra special because if dealing with the pandemic wasn't enough, Israel is also still recovering from another horrible round of violence with Hamas. Anytime Israel is under attack, we feel it here in our Jewish communities, and we want to be able to help. That is why our Federation partners with the Israeli Trauma Coalition to ensure the Israeli people have the resources they need to stay strong and resilient, even during those most difficult times. This past month was no different, and the Israeli Trauma Coalition was working around the clock again, all throughout Israel to respond to the pressing needs of a population under attack. Today's program also highlights another one of our Federation's amazing partners in Israel, and is another example of how our LA Jewish community plays a role in helping to build a stronger Israeli population and a bright future for Israel, just in a slightly different way. Today, with the help of renowned Israeli author Etgar Keret, we will learn about the work of the Israeli Center for Education Innovation, or ICEI, which helps, among many things, promote literacy among Israeli youth. The ICEI does incredible work with diverse student populations throughout Israel, and their literacy program and writing contest that we are fortunate enough to be a part of is just one of them. We are joined today by Don Futterman, the Executive Director of this ICEI. In just a little bit, we will have the pleasure to meet two remarkable students, Mayan Worldke and Avishag Ben Arush, who participated in our ICEI writing competition and who sat down with Don to talk in English about their writing and what their stories mean to them. Along with Don, we are also, of course, thrilled to be joined live by one of Israel's top writers, Etgar Keret. Etgar Keret is the most popular writer among Israel's young generation and has also received international acclaim. He has been published in the New York Times, Le Monde, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Paris Review, and Zoe Trope, among others. And over 40 short movies have been based on his stories, one of which won the American MTV Prize. He has also written several films, and his feature film, Risk Cutters, a love story, won several international awards. He has received numerous awards, including the Book Publishers Association's Platinum Prize several times, the Prime Minister's Prize, the Minister of Culture's Cinema Prize, the Jewish Quarterly Wingate Prize, and the prestigious French Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres decoration. He has twice been a finalist for the O'Connor Short Story Award. Keret's book have been published abroad in 42 languages in 45 countries. Before we get started, we want to remind all of you on the Zoom with us today of a few ways to access the writings of our guests. First, you should already have received an email upon registering for the Zoom that had links to purchase two of Etgar's books. Hopefully, you were able to purchase those already, but in case you have not, the Federation team on the Zoom will put them in the chat. We also will share in the chat a link to view Etgar's short story, Breaking the Pig, a story he will discuss with our ICEI students a bit later. And finally, we want to offer you all a free gift courtesy of our friends at the ICEI. We have a book titled Stories at the Center, which includes 12 short stories written by 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th graders in Israel who all participated in the ICEI writing competition. Dan has a copy of the book, which he can show you, which of course has been translated into English. We have a copy for everyone. So again, Dan and the Federation team will put a link to the chat where you can sign up and enter your address, and we will send you the book. After that long introduction and setting the stage, I'm thrilled to officially start the program and turn it back over to Dan at the Federation, Don Futterman, Executive Director of the ICEI, and Israeli writer Etgar Keret. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Dan. At ICI, we're absolutely thrilled to be partnered with the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles. You have a phenomenal team here. They were with us this morning. Aaron Goldberg and Shira Katz-Winkler came down to Ashkelon, where we conducted our 8th annual Young Writers Competition finale. Because of Corona, we couldn't bring hundreds and hundreds of kids together, but we did as a sign of solidarity with the children of the South and our students in Ashkelon. We met in one of our schools, and the kids were extremely excited. They got to meet one of the great Israeli children's writers, Shlomo Abbas, and the program was Zoomed throughout our network. ICI is the leading nonprofit in Israel for turning around failing and underperforming elementary schools serving low-income communities. Just like in the States and elsewhere in the world, your chances of getting a high-quality education correlate almost directly to the socioeconomic status of your community, and we are trying to level the playing field for the kids in Israel's low-income communities so they are ready to succeed in middle school and high school and throughout their academic careers and Army service in this country. The past 2 years, the past 2 school years were turned upside down by COVID-19. Our team, with your help and your support, was crucial here. We're able to work round the clock to keep teachers focused, to keep students engaged through distance learning, through communications in any medium that we could, digital platforms, WhatsApp, any device that we could. And now that the kids are back in school, we know we have our work cut out for us. The ultimate mission, the overriding mission of elementary school is to give kids literacy skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Those are the skills they need to succeed in every arena of learning. Every year we have a writing competition to help encourage kids to write more. This year we got 6,000 stories, all about living through Corona. One of our winning stories today was about a child whose sister is hearing impaired and talking about the difficulty of, because she's used to reading lips, and when everyone started wearing masks, she couldn't communicate anymore, and they had to help her find other ways to communicate with people. Another one about a kid who was in quarantine in his room, and through Morse code discovered there was another kid in quarantine on the other side of the wall in the apartment next door, and they became friends. So the kids' imaginations are just incredible. I think, Etgar, you would have loved these stories, and I know they love your story. We'll hear some of the kids talking about one of the stories, Breaking the Pig, which is actually taught in the Israeli high school curriculum. That is quite a feat to have one of your works integrated into the curriculum. So we want to thank you all. We see you as amazing partners, and you are helping us try to fulfill this crucial vision for Israel. And now I got to meet Etgar a couple of weeks ago, and if you haven't seen him or met him, you will just be delighted. Etgar, I have lots of questions, and I'm sure our viewers are going to have some questions for you as well. Let me start. Make sure you're unmuted. And I'll stay, let me ask the first question. You know, your stories are so universal, and as Karen mentioned, translated into dozens and dozens of languages, popular all over the world, and yet I find them extremely Israeli at the same time. Maybe there's a dimension that's almost anti-sentimental, but let me ask you, how do you see the Israeli side of your experience, your life, growing up and living in this country? How does that affect your writing?
Well, my greatest influence in writing came from actually diaspora Jewish writers like Beshevi Singer or Shalom Aleichem and or Kafka. And I once said, at the time it was seen as a very provocative saying, but I once said that I feel like a Jew living in the diaspora of Israel. And what I was trying to refer to was the fact that I, as a son of two Holocaust survivors who immigrated to Israel, I was very, very close to their perspective, as their perspective was that of an insider, outsider, of people who assimilated in the Israeli society, but also who had an exterior perspective, kind of being raised in Eastern Europe and coming from a different country and sensibility. And this I think it created some kind of a two-tier thinking in my mind, that on the one hand, I was 100% Israeli, going through school, high school, army, reserve duty, university, speaking like a Israeli, and eating hummus like a Israeli, but at the same time, being very, very close to my parent, I was always also able to look at this reality from the outside in some kind of a critical way. So I think that this kind of two-tier thinking, which I think is very typical for a diaspora Jewry anywhere, because I think, if you think about, let's say, many of the theories that came to the world, like it doesn't matter if it's a communism, or psychoanalysis, were created by Jews just for the sole fact that they were living in Europe and they were part of the system, but being immigrants or living in the diaspora, they were also had this kind of exterior notion. If you think about, I don't know, like Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, then you can't help thinking that he studied physics with all his peers, which was a kind of Newtonian physics, and at the same time that he was an insider to those physics, he had this kind of outsider point of view saying, oh yeah, but can I put this into some kind of another context? So this kind of two-tier thinking, I think, is very, very Jewish, and I kind of kept it because of my parents, even though I was born Israeli.
Do you see that changing? It's a kind of a double consciousness. Certainly those of us who've immigrated to Israel or Olim know what that feels like very strongly. But now you're also a father and raising a child here. Do you feel like that's changing at all now that you're raising the next generation?
Well, yeah, well, I think that the next generation, or my son's generation, is much more global in a sense, because they're very much on the internet. I think that it's very, very easy for my son, let's say, to communicate with American kids or Italian kids or German kids. Basically they play the same games, they see the same TV series. So there is a change, but I want to say that there is something about the ways that me and my wife are trying to educate him, is that I think that many times when you're Israelis and you have this kind of Sabra mentality and you're just kind of proud of it and you want to kind of run forward. But for us, it's very, very important to introduce to him Jewish values and Jewish culture. Because when I grew up in the 70s, there was almost a narrative as if to be an Israeli or to be a Jew, it's like opposite. It's like it's totally different words, because the Israeli is we go to the military, we're very fit, we work the land, we are doing all those kind of things that the diaspora Jewry were not supposed to do. But as I grew up with my parents, I kind of missed a lot of those Jewish perspectives that were lost when we tried, to make this kind of a perfect Israeli, because I feel that let's say Jewish humor, Jewish reflexive thought, the fact that the Jewish community were always led by cultural and spiritual figures. It could be rabbis, it could be ideological thinkers, or things that I missed in the Israeli society, as if in Israel, from this aftershock, we really wanted to have more like generals and the people who are doing all those kind of things that they were unable to do in Europe. And when I raise my son, it's very, very important for me to put a central part of the aspect of Jewishness in his identity, and not just to settle for the Israeli one. Because I think that that this idea is that when I grew up in the 70s, this idea is that as if the diaspora was a place in which Jews were prosecuted and pogromized and murdered, and Israel is the place where we flourish. Maybe it was necessary in a time where life was a little bit harder. But now, when it's easy enough, we can really afford to learn more about our historical Jewry past, and to learn how not only Jews had flourished in the diaspora, but how societies in which Jews were members were able to flourish and advance, and to give this a more important weight in our children's education.
Do you think today that writers like yourself are the spiritual leaders, or provide that kind of inspiration
Oh, I
to this
wish.
generation?
The truth is that, in Israel, we have a tradition in which writers are very much politically involved. Basically, whenever something happened, and in all the time it was Nathan Alterman, our famous poet. After that, it was Amos Oz or David Grossman or A.B. Joshua. The idea is that when something happens, you would run and see what writers have to say about it. And I can say, as somebody who had been writing op-ed for the past, I would say, 25 years, whenever something of great magnitude is happening, I could really see the decline of the impact that such op-eds had. I could say that that there were moments in my life as a writer in which I would say, like, I would publish an op-ed and it could get into me getting death threats for it or hate mail, and I would say, oh, this is horrible. But if my current situation, I kind of miss it, because right now I write op-eds and people come to me in the street and say, oh, we loved your last fiction book, or we loved your last TV series, and I say, yeah, but what about my op-ed? We don't read this stuff anymore. And I think that in the end, at the age of social media, where basically all the time everybody writes op-eds and we're throwing them at each other, and with this kind of a complete democracy in which your importance is decided by the number of followers, and if you know how to take nice photos and go like this with your lips, you can outbeat any writer at any given moment.
I want to ask you a little bit about your writing process. How do you know, or when do you know that you have a story, that you have an idea that will actually turn into a story, or alternatively that it's not going to take off as a story?
Well, I can say that I think that stories usually begin with with stuttering, with some kind of stuttering, because as you see, I'm not very, even when I speak, I get stuck. So I think that stories always begin at a point where I try to explain something to somebody or to myself, and I find myself stuck. I don't have this explanation, and this is always kind of a starting point for a story. And for me, a story is, let's say, like this very kind of a quick animal running around that you cannot for me, I cannot recognize the story before I wrote it. I don't know what it is exactly like, but if I find some kind of an enigmatic sentence that stays with me, an image that I saw in the streets that is stuck in my mind, some kind of a relationship, or even a tone of somebody who speaks, and his tone kind of stays with me, then when I write a story, I basically kind of jump into this and I write a lot of stuff, knowing that probably nothing will amount of it, hoping that that one of those paragraphs will be like catching the tail of the story, and then the story could drag me around a little bit, like in some kind of I don't know, a poetic rodeo. And in the end, if I'll be able to grab it, I'll have the story. But to be honest, it's really only after I read what I wrote, I have even the smallest idea if what I have is a story or just a confused a set of sentences.
Some of the most startling images in your stories seem very dreamlike. I'm wondering if your dreams influence your stories, or it's going the other way, that you're writing your own dreams.
So I think there's something about writing that writing is basically sharing with people some kind of a subjective perception, and I'm saying that because the truth is that we're not that used to doing it. Like, I mean, if all of us we're sitting here together, and let's say if any of us believes in UFOs and aliens, or in I don't know, ghosts, then we would not know it about each other, because this is the stuff that you keep to yourself, and the stuff that we share is all the stuff we agree on, and the pragmatic things. And I must say that, that through writing, I discovered that I have so many strange images and strange thoughts in my life that all my life I was trying to suppress. It's just they're renovating the building in which I live. So they build this. I don't know how you call those things that the workers can climb on to get to higher floors. Uh, and what happened is
The scaffolding.
scaff- scaffolds. So what happened was that about a week ago, I opened the door to a balcony, and I saw one of my favorite cats. We have cats in the yard, not mine, was sitting in my chair uh, at the uh, at the balcony. And when I came out, I was kind of just looking at it, and I guess I was looking at it for a very long time. And then my son came and went like shoo, and the cat left. And he said to me, why were you staring at the cat for so long? And I said to him, to be honest, when I came out to the balcony, the cat was sitting upright at my chair and looking at me, and I was kind of waiting for him to speak. And my son laughed and said, "Oh, Dad, you're so crazy," and left. But to be honest, this was what I was feeling inside my mind, So let's say if this was a job interview, I wouldn't share my thought with you. But if I would want to write a story, then a story about a guy who go out at the balcony and sees a cat staring at him in a patronizing way, and he waits for the cat to speak, then maybe a story could begin there. So for me, many times, like, stories is basically kind of a bringing out all those kind of things that all my life before writing I was trying to hide and to submerge and to put in the background, and not to end those thoughts. You see a cat, you wait for him to speak and say, "Oh, come on, like, sure, I got something practical to do." So I think that there is something about my subjective perception that is kind of weird, and I bet that all of our subjective perspective are kind of weird. But it's just that those of us who don't write are doing a very good job of hiding this kind of a surrealistic aspect of our thinking.
In the 7 Good Years, it's directly autobiographical, and you write with eloquence and feeling about your love for your father, your love for your son. When you're writing something that's autobiographical, that's not fiction, does it feel like you're using a different part of your brain, or is it similar to writing the stories that you write?
It's totally different, just for the simple fact that when I write a nonfiction piece, I know how it's gonna end, like, at least plot wise, because it's like something happened, somebody slapped me, my wife kissed me, we bought an apartment, I don't know, I know what's gonna happen. And when I write stories, I really have a very vague idea of where the story is gonna go. And this is a big difference, because I I think that let's say the difference between fiction and nonfiction for me is that when I write fiction, it's like you go out on an adventure. You're Indiana Jones. You're in the jungle. Don't know what's hiding behind the tree. And when you write nonfiction, you kind of retelling an adventure. And being kind of an adrenaline-seeking guy, then I'm always drawn to fiction. But when I write nonfiction, what happens is that I feel that I know the story, but once I have it written, I kind of can't help have this feeling that I kind of revisited it. It sometimes, it could be that I'm writing a story, let's say, I don't know, about the only time in my life that my father had slapped me, and while writing this text, I'm able to go beyond my child experience, and kind of as if like kind of pan in the room and see things that were out of frame when I was a kid, and be able to kind of see myself through my father's eyes, or all this kind of thing, and in a strange way bring a sense of closure to things that were left open for many many years. So I'm not kind of putting down nonfiction. It's really really helpful and powerful, but I think that I'm always kind of more attracted to fiction, and also maybe because of this kind of sense of ownership, because Because when people read the Seven Good Years, they say, "Oh my God, you had such an amazing life, such wonderful thing happened to you." And I say, "Yeah, but I don't deserve the credit. The guy who's up there, who created this word, he invented this." But when I write a fiction story, I can actually say, "Yeah, that's my idea."
Terrific. Thank you. I have some more questions. I want to see if Dan, if you wanted to ask any questions at this point.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have some of your fans and your readers on with us, so we're very excited about that. So I want to ask just a couple questions that have come in. The first question is regarding one of your stories that they think was maybe published in an American magazine, maybe something like a Hadassah magazine, about a parent who suffocated their child, and that the story was kind of disturbing to the reader. The question, it's kind of like two parts. Number one, was that intentional to make it a little disturbing? And what's that story really about? Where'd it come from?
Yeah, so this story, I think it's called The Pillow Monster, is a story I've written, I think, I don't know, like 30 years ago, and I've never published it. And recently I found it, and I had this feeling that the reason that I never published it, and that I kind of suppressed it in my mind, was that the story scared me. And I think that sometimes when I write a story, it scares me because it kind of taps to different parts of you. And I think that as I became a more experienced writer, I know I don't get as easily scared as I used to when I was a child. I think that that the story, it is a story about a parent killing a child, but I think that all my stories, what happens in them is usually a metaphor for something else. It's not. It's very rarely the thing itself. And I think that for me, this story was really. I wrote it just as I was getting out of the army, and there was something that kind of scared me a lot, and that was this idea of this kind of glorification of death. When you sacrifice yourself for your country, the idea of parents who had lost their children and saying, we feel okay with it because we did it for the country. And with me being this kind of, this feeling at the time being a soldier, that I'm this kind of Isaac, who's being sacrificed, I had this kind of anxiety. And I think that in my story, the father is some kind of these big ideological narratives that calls you for an ultimate sacrifice, and the child was this part of me that wanted to have control over his life and not be kind of suffocated by this narrative. And again, I think that don't talk about the dreamlike aspect of stories. Then I think that let's say if I take two extremities, then some of the dreams are good dreams. Me and Brad Pitt, we were having a coffee on the balcony, and he said, "Hey man, would you write me a script? I've always wanted to play, a, a Israeli living in Tel Aviv. And so you have those kind of dreams, but you also have the nightmares, in which my rabbit is running after me, trying to kill me. So I think that this is kind of a nightmarish story, and I think that many times when people read those kind of stories, they kind of attribute them to the wishes of the writers when they don't know their anxieties. I can tell you that my late parents, when I started writing, told me that that it kind of bothered them that many of my characters lose their parents, and like my dad said, "You had enough of us." And I said to him, "No, Dad, this is the thing that scares me the most. So this is the kind of things that comes up in my nightmares and comes up in my stories."
Wow, thank you for sharing. We know that you travel a lot. Is there any place or places where you have found inspiration outside of Israel that you've traveled to, and sometimes maybe you'll even want to go there if you want to tap into some of this imagination that you've been talking about?
Yeah, well, I must say that and I'm saying it sadly, that if you read my stories, the sceneries are mostly focused around is human beings, and animals. But but there are very few descriptions, of forests or snowy mountains, and the and I think that traveling is very, very important and crucial for me, but mostly the aspects that I meet people who live in different parts of the world and think differently, and that some of them I can even call my friends. And in that sense, I think that there are kind of let's say, a few spots in the world that are important for me. New York is one of them, just for the simple fact that I have so many friends in New York, so many people who are important for me. And in this pandemic year, I discovered how difficult it was to be far away from them. I would say that Warsaw is another place, strangely, because my parents were Polish. My mother was originally from a village very close to Warsaw, and she was in the Warsaw ghetto for a part of the war. And for me, there is something about going to Poland. It's this kind of feeling of closure, the idea of basically my parents being haunted there, and the family being killed, and with me coming there to kind of to reconcile with this past, being respected as a writer, being in public places, having a dialogue with people, with important Polish intellectuals, and also having a very close Polish friends that are not necessarily Jewish. So for me, when I go to Poland, I really feel this kind of a continuation or heritage that I always found missing in my life, because being a child of Holocaust survivor, with my parents losing their families in the war, I always kind of felt that when you look back, it's kind of like a black hole. My parents talked very little about it. And this kind of wish to, I don't know, see the trees that my great grandfather planted, or see the hut in which my mother was born, was something that I've always missed. When the first time I went to Poland, my mother gave me the address of the place in which she was born, and when I got there, it was a bank. And that night, by the way, I had a dream in which I go to a Polish bank, and I see the teller delivering my mother uh, inside the bank. So with this kind all of this stuff missing, coming to Poland kind of feels that in a little sense I'm kind of closing this gap.
Well, yeah, and
Yeah.
I know, I know Karen can relate. Just one quick follow-up, Don, and then we'll go back to you. Just curious, you mentioned how you, in the streets of Israel, you hear people talking about your stories, but maybe not so much about these op-eds and some of the more. I'm curious, just on that note of traveling, you're certainly a cultural icon, and whether you want it or not, when you're traveling, you're representing Israel. And here in the United States, we think about things like that a lot. I'm curious, just very quickly, if you think about that a lot, if you're different in how you talk about things outside of Israel versus inside of Israel, and what that aspect of your life is.
Well, I think that when we try to think about how do you represent best your country, then there could be many answers to that. My personal answer is that, let's say, if I thought that I came from a horrible country that I love, if I thought that I come from, I don't know, a tyranny in which people were vicious, if I loved my country, it would be necessary for me to lie, to protect it. But I think that I come from a great place, and I come from a great tradition of debating, of challenging. I always, when I have political arguments here, sometimes they can get very heated, and many of them I have with people in the religious right wing, and I say to them, listen, when you get angry, even God could stand an argument with Abraham, with Job, with Jonah. He didn't lose it. So if God, who's much wiser than you, was was able to stand a polemic, even though he was sure that he was right, then maybe can be modest enough to contain this argument. So I think that coming from this place, I feel that, let's say, I'm for the new government in Israel, and was against Netanyahu keeping his power during the trial. So this was my opinion. I never thought that when I go overseas, I should hide it, because I feel that the moment that you first of all, when you try to hide something, people notice. You know, I know, because many times I try to hide things, people notice. But I say more than that, that I think that the difference, let's say, between Israel and Russia or in Iran, that somebody could be a prominent member of a society and still criticize it. You know, in the time of Trump, when people who didn't like Trump politics would go overseas, and you know, the fact that they were able to criticize their own president just showed the power of the democracy. So I really feel that sometimes by the way, when I go to the US, I find it a lot with American Jewry. There is this kind of feeling that, you know, that Israel is a small, fragile thing that we have to protect. And, you know, if we just sneeze, you know, it will die. But we are a super powerful, healthy country that can deal with any criticism. And actually, I think that we want this criticism. We want to be in this position where people would say, we like that, but we don't like that. And the expectations that because I'm Israeli or because we're Jewish, we should a priori uphold and support everything that the government does, it's not a democratic idea. The same way that you as an American could be against a policy in your country, then you as Jews could be against the policies of the government without this meaning that you don't support Israel or you don't support the Israeli cause. By the way, if you think about it, when, let's say, if I see somebody in the street doing something that is wrong, I don't know, using drugs, then most likely I wouldn't say anything. But if I would see my brother doing it or my son doing it, I would criticize because they mean more for me. So I think that American Jewry should understand that actually criticizing some things in Israel, you know, now there's a new government, so the ones that didn't want to criticize the old one, they can try and criticize the new one. But criticizing it, it's basically showing that you care. It's just showing your affection to the country. While taking a step back means that you're just this neighbor saying, you know what, that's their family. They can do whatever they want.
Before we meet some of our wonderful students who are winners in our previous Young Writers competitions, Mayan and Avishad from Rehovot and Hadera, I want to ask you two questions, and they're connected to the discussion with the kids. Are you always a character in your stories? And in the story, Breaking the Pig, which you mentioned, which is part of the curriculum, are you a character in that story as well?
I always identify with something in the story that kind of helps me to start writing it. But the strange thing about the story Breaking the Pig, I just tell the story in a couple of sentences. It's a story about a child who gets a piggy bank because his father wants to teach him to respect money. So he saves the money by putting coins inside the piggy bank, but during the process he becomes friends with the piggy bank. He loves the piggy bank. The piggy bank kind of soothes his lonely childhood. And when the pig is full with coins, his father wants to break the pig and take out the money for the kid to teach him his lesson, but the kid is more interested in keeping the piggy bank intact, you know. So when I wrote this story, many people took it at face value, and they said, "Oh, so your father, he was greedy and a bad educator?" And I say, no. And the truth is that when I try to recognize in my story, I must say that I feel that I'm the piggy bank, in that sense that if you look at the piggy bank, the piggy bank, you put coins in it, but those coins, there's no way in which they can come out. And I think that as a child, being raised by two Holocaust survivors, you know, my mother was orphaned when she was 7 or 8, you know, with her mother and her kid brother killed in front of her eyes. I realized that my parents had gone through so much suffering that my duty in life was not to add to their pain. So I would say metaphorically is that every time kind of a coin of sorrow or pain got into me, I knew that the only way that I could express it would be if I would be shattered to pieces. Because I never cried, or no, I only cried once in front of my parents. I I would never express frustration because I knew that they had enough of it. And I must say that for me, being able to write stories was kind of a way, figuring a way out how you can take those coins of sorrow outside of the piggy bank without breaking the piggy bank. How I can share my suffering and anxieties in a way that doesn't encumber on people or makes them sadder, but somehow you're able to turn them to something that is aesthetic and beautiful and useful. And I guess I needed that.
Well, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. Before we meet the kids, let me turn it back over to Dan and of course, encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to run out and read Etgar's books. They are unique and just wonderful.
Thank you, Don and Etgar. So we're going to quickly transition to the segment with our students. Just a timing update for folks online so they know this will take us to about 5 past the hour, so 5 past 11 or so here in Los Angeles, 5 past 9 p.m. in Israel. And then we'll come back, just for a couple more minutes after which to wrap up and maybe ask a few final questions. So with that, we're going to begin the segment with our students.
So Mayan and Avishag, we are really looking forward to hearing you talk about your writing. Now, you've both been the heads of the student councils at your respective schools. Mayan, you held the position at the Yavna School last year when you were in 6th grade, and Avishag, this is the 2nd year you've been head of the student council at your school in Rehovot. Mayan, what have you liked most about being in this position and being a leader in the community?
I wanted to make it different. I worked really hard to get elected as head. I was able to make changes. In our student activity, changing the ring sound between classes and the kinds of music played in school, I'd meet with our principal, Moshe. At times there was a lot of pressure. It became even harder during Corona.
I'm sure. Avishag?
So I want to make changes the students wanted. Sometimes it's been possible and sometimes not. I work closely with the principal and teachers. Before Corona last year, we planned special events like Purim party and talent show that we had outside. They were a lot of fun, and I'm really proud of those projects and the special holiday celebration we started. We had new music and new dances.
And during Corona?
During Corona, we had all sorts of games to keep us connected, which hasn't been easy. But now we're back in school and meeting face to face. We had fun sports days and a talent show.
Mayan, your school was and still is a pilgrimage site for teachers from all over the country to come learn about how you and your fellow students conduct classroom conversations.
Yes, we learned from the beginning of elementary school how to really listen, make eye contact, ask clear questions, so we could have open and respectful conversations in which everyone was able to take part in some way.
And Avishag, your school has also focused a lot on speech and respectful conversations.
Yes, it helped me a lot over the years by bringing everyone in class. I got to know more kids and make more friends. I had to think and express myself clearly when we talked about the books we were reading or the stories we were writing.
Have you enjoyed writing?
Yes, but it's not always easy. I've got a lot of support from my teachers and Tilly, the ICI coach.
What do you like to write about?
I write for myself, and almost all my stories are based on real events. I just wrote a story about a girl who gets sick with the coronavirus and the problem she has.
And Mayan, what is your writing process? What do you like to write about?
I think about and write stories based on my life. In class, we'd often brainstorm ideas together and read our writing to each other. The students and our teacher Zahava will give their feedback. We learn different ways to correct characters and tell their stories. Sometimes we will resolve the stories, and other times we will leave them open-ended. I wrote about my father's aliyah from Ethiopia. The ICEI Young Writer Competition was also a motivator.
And what was your father's journey to Israel like?
When my father Leon was 11 years old, he and his family left Ethiopia as part of a group leaving the country. They left late at night to not get caught.
This is quite a story.
Yes, they traveled many days and nights through the forest of Ethiopia and the desert of Sudan. Some of his family died of hunger in Sudan on the way, including my aunt Mulu's 2 young children. My family couldn't fly out in the same plane and didn't know if they would see each other again, but they reunited in Israel. I wanted to hear and tell my father's story, what really happened.
Well, that is so moving. Avishag, you've written a story, Roots, about a girl who thinks she knows everything about her family and discovers more and more secrets when researching her family history for her school Roots project.
Yes, when I did my Roots project last year, I started hearing stories from my grandparents that I couldn't believe. How my grandmother worked in a factory and got shot in the leg by accident.
Shot in the leg? And this one, the Transit Camp of Stories, this was your award-winning story in the ICEI Young Writers Competition.
Yes, this is about my family's aliyah from Iraq, the transit camps, the Mabarot.
So here are some excerpts from the Transit Camp of Stories by Avishag Ben Arush. The Transit Camp of Stories. It all started when I was sitting in the sofa in the lounge of their house, the most comfortable place for me, and playing with my mobile phone. My grandfather came over, touched me on the shoulder and said, "When I was a boy, there were no mobile phones, and we couldn't play with the things that you play with today. In the transit camp," he continued, "we played and made dolls and soccer balls out of old newspapers." "What's a transit camp?" I asked with curiosity. "It's the place where the immigrants lived who came to Israel from different countries when the state of Israel was established. Everyone knew everybody else there because it was a very small population. I'll tell you a story about my time in the transit camp when I was a young and starving boy." "Why starving?" I asked worriedly. "Because in the transit camp, they didn't give us a lot of food. For supper, they gave us tea and biscuits for the whole family. And when you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go outside and walk in the mud because there were no toilets there. Everything was flooded in the cold winters." And then you close your story with, "When I heard my grandfather's sad story, my eyes filled with tears, and I was filled with sorrow. I felt that my grandfather was a courageous man because he and his family experienced many hardships. I imagined myself having to go through those hardships. What would I have done? Would I have managed? It was hard for me to imagine." Ever since, when I learn about the transit camps in my Jewish heritage lessons, I get teary-eyed, and I remember my grandfather's story. I love my grandfather, and I'll always love him. I admire him for his strength. I think that the fact that he went through hardships prepared him for other difficult situations. My grandfather and grandmother are role models for their strength and for the part they played in building the country. Grandpa Avraham and Grandma Rosa, I dedicate this story to you with love. Avishag, your writing and your narrative relating your grandparents' experiences are so powerful. How did your family react when they read your writing?
My grandfather was really excited that I wrote it. The experience in the transit camps stays with you for life.
And how did it feel to win the ICEI Young Writers Competition?
I was so excited, it was so surprised. When they called me to the stage and after, then I asked my teachers who were with me at the ceremony if it's just a dream or really happened. It was a surprise.
Mayan, I would also like to share some excerpts from another one of your stories, The New Student, your award-winning story in the ICEI Young Writers Competition. The New Student by Mayan Worke. Did you ever have a friend who had a hard time with her schoolwork? Did you ever have a good friend whom the other kids laughed at? I did. I'll tell you about it. At the beginning of 4th grade, a new girl came to our school. Her family had just arrived in the country. Her name was Einat. Einat's skin was a different color from the other kids. She had black braids and honey brown eyes. Now, after Einat goes through some hurtful experiences caused by another student in the class, Shira, this is what happens. In class, Einat was alone again. No one sat beside her. I gathered my courage and asked the teacher if I could sit next to Einat. And when the teacher told us what we had to do, Einat didn't understand, and she asked a lot of questions. And Shira jumped on her. How could it take you so long to understand something so simple? I saw that Einat's feelings were really hurt. I didn't say anything. I just moved close to her and explained very slowly so that she would understand. I remembered that the same thing had happened to me when I was new, and I remembered that nobody helped me. And I didn't want that to happen to someone else in the class. At recess, Eliana and Shira ignored me. I played with Einat. From then on, every morning, Einat and I would come to school early, and I would give Einat private lessons. I also helped her with her homework, which was hard for her. Shira realized that she had made a mistake and asked me if we could go back to being friends again. And at first I said no. And I explained to her, because you didn't only hurt Einat, you also hurt me. In the end, we all forgot, and slowly we became closer and we made up. And now it's already the middle of the year, and we're all friends. So let's tie this conversation all together. Do you feel like your love of reading and writing has helped you at all in other parts of your life, Mayan?
Reading and writing has always helped me in school, especially on tests.
Avishag?
Yes, I think it's important to express ourselves. Writing and sharing stories has helped me understand better my family journey. Writing has helped me in the future and has helped me now.
Mayan, Avishag, I want to ask you one final question. What advice would you give to someone else in your situation, either about writing, finding inspiration in the world around you, or being a leader in your community? Mayan?
Don't be afraid to take chances and have a new experience. There's a saying which I really like. רק מי שלוקח סיכון והולך רחוק, מגלה עד כמה רחוק הוא יכול להגיע.
Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. That's a quote from the poet T.S. Eliot. Thanks, Mayan. Avishag?
If you believe in yourself, people will believe in you. Don't be afraid to follow your dreams and you will succeed.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Sam. Good.
Hi.
So I'd like to introduce you to the writer Etgar Keret. Now, one of your well-known stories is the story Breaking the Pig, which we've all read. And in the story, a boy develops a special relationship with a piggy bank which his father gives him, which he doesn't really want at first. But his father forces him to take it to learn about the value of money and saving money.
It's great to meet you. What inspired you to write?
I think that when I see something in my life or that is unresolved, it's like, let's say if I see something in the street and it really moves me and I can't explain to people why I'm in tears or why I'm excited, this is really when I begin to write. It's kind of a way to find words to describe those things that in real life and one-on-one interaction I can't find the word to explain.
Did the story really happen to you?
The story, it didn't happen the way that it is written, because my father was an amazing father and he never forced me to do anything. But I do have a childhood experience related to a piggy bank. When I was a young boy, what I want to say is that I grew up in a family where both my parents were Holocaust survivors. And knowing how much suffering my parents had gone through, my mother was orphaned in a very young age and lost her brother. I was always trying not to upset my parents. I didn't want them to feel bad. So one of the things that was instinctive, it wasn't a decision, I would never cry next to my parents. Because even if I would be in pain or if I would feel bad, I would say, I don't want my parents to feel any worse than they feel already. It would be unfair to burden them with my suffering. And the only time I cried next to my parents as a child was when a friend of theirs coming from overseas he brought me a piggy bank as a present. And we couldn't communicate because I couldn't speak any English. And he showed me the piggy bank and he put a coin inside. And then the moment I took the piggy bank, I turned it, looking at his tummy, trying to find out how you can take the coins out. And I saw that there was no way to take the coins out. So I was mimicking, I saying, how can I take the coin out? And he was also mimicking, and he did this movement of, like, if you want the coin, you have to break the pig. And the moment he did this movement, I started crying. And my parents couldn't understand why I was crying because nothing happened. The first thing they thought I fell or I hurt myself. And I couldn't explain to them why I cried. And only after writing this story, more than 20 years later, I realized that the reason that I was crying was that I identified with the piggy bank. And for me, what I felt that in my life, all the time I had to swallow those coins of pain and sorrow and anxiety that I was hiding from my parents, so I was holding them inside. And when I said to the person, okay, how can I take this pain out? Then with this movement he showed me, you can never take it out, only if you break to pieces, So I guess this was something that caused me to cry because it seemed as if my life was kind of hopeless. But I can tell you that in hindsight that the only way to take those coins of sorrow outside of the piggy bank and keeping the piggy bank whole is basically writing stories. Because when you write stories, you can express your pain, you can express all your weaknesses, and at the same time stay intact because you don't play it out in real life, you play it out in your mind.
What did you learn from writing the story?
I think that again, what I've learned from writing the story is that there is a way to take things outside of yourself without shattering to pieces. I think that there is a way of us taking things that are very, very deep inside us, very intimate things, and sharing them with other people without losing our wholeness, without shattering to pieces. I think that was my lesson.
Girls, you both read this story. What did you think of the story?
I think it was really good.
I have a question. I want to ask you a question. In the end of the story, he takes the piggy bank and he leaves it in a field, right?
Yes.
So let's say if you try to imagine what happens next, let's say if you try to imagine him going back home or what happens to the piggy bank, can you tell me what's going to happen next in the story after the story ends?
After a few years, he find the piggy bank, and they find him, and that's the good end.
There is a happy end. They get to be together.
It's the stories and kind of sad. So I think like Mayan, but after you find it, you understand you need to break it. You break it to get the money, because you get older, and then that's again sad, but you happy that you understand it. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well, I think it's true for some people. I must say that I still have my teddy bear and all my childhood toys, and I still keep them. And let's say if somebody would offer me money for them, I would not sell them. But I'm sure that many children do grow up and don't feel as if they need their toys anymore.
What I think, and after you answer to me, you did it for yourself, not because somebody told you need to do it.
Yes, for sure. And I think, when you asked me also about what you learned from the story, then I guess when you look at the piggy bank, it has two functions. One of them is the pragmatic function. It keeps money, you can take the money, you can buy stuff. And the other is a more emotional and spiritual aspect. It's smiley, it gives you a good mood, it makes you feel less lonely. So I guess that, sometimes in life you have to weigh between those two things. Maybe sometimes if you're hungry, then you are interested in pragmatic things. But if you've had enough to eat, maybe you would seek other things. Personally, I can say that I think that friendship is probably the most important thing for me in my life. Not the value of friendship, not kind of being a good friend, but this idea of fighting loneliness and solitude, of being with someone, of creating an acoustics in which you can share your emotions and thoughts. It would be difficult for me to imagine myself without that. And I think, when I was a child, I was a sickly child. I had asthma, and many times I had to stay home. So I think that a long part of my childhood, I've yearned for human companionship. I wanted to be with friends because I would stay home alone. And maybe, in a sense, also making up story was a way for me to feel less lonely. Because if you make a story, then the story is your friend.
You found a friend, you don't want to break it.
Yeah.
Is it very different writing short stories, plays, or screenplays?
It's very, very different, because I think that when you write a screenplay or when you write a play, then basically it's a little bit like writing a recipe for a cake. So basically you just write the recipe and then people make that cake, but when you write the recipe, you can't taste the recipe, you can't lick the recipe and feel how good it is. While when you write a story, it's like you're baking the cake. You finish the story, and even though I wrote it, I can read it immediately, and it's kind of self-sufficient and everything is there. So there is something I think about writing scripts and writing plays that it's more of a long distance running. It's kind of a collaborative process with other people in which basically you keep advancing one pace at a time without knowing where you're going to get. While writing a short story is something that is spontaneous and almost immediate, and in that sense maybe a more nonchalant process.
Okay. Thank you very much
Thank
for coming
you.
and being with us today.
תודה.
Thank you.
תודה. תמשיכו לכתוב.
Thank you so much, Mayan. Thank you so much, Avishag. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. And I want to encourage both of you to keep reading and keep writing. We're looking forward to reading more of your stories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we enjoyed seeing the kids and to see the kids talking with you, Etgar, and hear some more commentary on Breaking the Pig. Dan, do we have time for any more questions, or we need to wrap up?
Yeah, well, we have time for if Etgar's still there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great. So I do want to ask just one final question. Actually, the same question for both of you. We'll start with you, Etgar, and then we'll have Don, you address it. We're doing this program today, and I think it's so remarkable that we have one of Israel's cultural icons, a writer who gives us so much pride, but also entertains us with the stories. And we're talking with one of the Federation's partners that really works to promote literacy and writing throughout Israeli society. And so it's kind of the merging of culture and education. And I'm curious, what that means to you, Etgar, to continue. You get to do something that's both entertainment, but also very important to academia, or very important to education, and promoting and teaching kids in the world of TikTok and phones and everything, that they still can have a great life writing and reading. And I'm curious what that means to you. And then Don, I know, this is kind of your life's work in Israel, so what it means to you. But we'll start with Etgar.
Well, I want to say that again, I think it's fundamentally different what the two of us are doing, and what Don is doing is something that is really, really important. And I think that in its basic, it's generous and it's selfless, and it's somebody kind of waking up and saying, okay, how can I make the world around me better? I'm afraid this is not the case for me. I wish I was as nice as Don, but with me, I feel that that uh, that the need to write usually comes from some wish to complete something that you cannot complete in a different way. It's like, if you see somebody going in the street with a crouch, you're not jealous of him for having a crouch. He has a crouch because he needs it. And I think that in that sense, uh, when my stories go out in the world and mean something for people, then there is something in me that gets mended. You know, something in me that let's say if I grew up feeling weird and strange, an outsider. If I grew up feeling that my thoughts and ideas were legitimate, my fears were childish and stupid, then by writing, I think that it's a little bit like kind of an AA meeting, you know, in which I kind of confess my faults, and maybe other people in the AA meeting gains power from it. But you know, but it's not as if I chose to be faulty. It's not as if I chose to have all those anxieties and problems. It's just that I'm trying to deal with that, and I feel very lucky that this is also helpful.
Well, first, I'll say that the gift of stories that you write, is also an act of incredible generosity, and we and kids and readers all over the world are benefiting from it. So there's also an altruistic side to the writer's mission in life. I say, we teach kids to read, we teach kids to write, and when they're reading, they're discovering the world, they're discovering other people's perceptions of the world, like yourself, and how you see the world, which is going to be unique and different from the way they see the world and experience life. And it triggers its own associations. You mentioned that you give gifts to kids and the kids do something entirely different with it than what the person who gave it is intending. And the same thing happens with stories. You write it maybe meaning one thing, and a child or an adult reader will experience something else. When we teach kids to write, we are giving them a tool not to record their thoughts. It isn't just to write down what they think, it's to discover what they think. It's to discover what they feel. They often don't know what they feel or what they think, and only by trying to put it into words do they find how to say it or find out what it is that they actually believe or what it is they care about. Sometimes they literally discover the word, or they discover that there is a word to express some feeling that they're having, and they didn't know that there was a word for that because they didn't know that anybody else ever felt that besides themselves. So the gift of writing is also, an extraordinary tool that we try to give to children, and something we hope that they'll take with them and throughout their lives as readers and writers.
Great. Thank you both. Now, we did actually have one quick question that came in, and I think it's a great question to end on. I don't know where it's going to lead to, but one of our listeners asked Etgar, has anybody ever thought that the pig may be a metaphor for Israel?
I think that every story I wrote, people thought it was a metaphor for Israel. Really, it's really because I once wrote a story about a child who has a very aggressive dog, and that the parents want to get rid of that dog. And I immediately got an interpretation saying the child is Israel, the kid is the Palestinians, the parents are the American, the European Union. And I say, no, I know this kid. I know the dog. Come on, so I think that when you come from a place that is so loaded, with tensions and colliding narratives, people always try to interpret it. I want to say that the most Jewish anecdote that I can tell about this story was that this story is taught in the Israeli school curriculum, and at some stage I got a call, and I didn't know who was speaking from the other side, but it sounded like those kind of teachers that you're scared of when you're in school, and it was somebody from the Ministry of Education, and she said to me, look, your story, we've been teaching it in school and it's very, very successful, but we're only teaching it in secular school, and we want to teach it also in religious schools. And so we had this great idea that instead of a piggy bank, with the pig not being a kosher animal, we can change it into a cow bank. And then the kid will get a cow bank and he can have a relationship with it, and we can teach it in religious schools. And I said, no, to her instinctive, I said, no, you can't do that. And she was quiet, and then I heard from the other side of the line, she said, "Do you hate religious people that much that you want to deprive them from your story as some kind of an attempt to take revenge on them?" And I said to her, no, no, no. And, and actually in my family, my sister is an ultra-Orthodox. I wrote about her in the 7 Good Years. She has 11 children and more than 40 grandchildren. I said to her, no, no, it's not that. So she said, before I started working in the Ministry of Education, I was a teacher. And whenever a kid did something wrong, I gave them a chance to explain. So I'm giving you a chance to explain. So I immediately felt guilty that I did something wrong. And I said to her, look, the reason I began writing was that all my life I took into account other people's needs and other people's feelings. So I could never really express my own needs and feelings because all the time I was just thinking about society. I wouldn't cry not to wake up people. I wouldn't complain, not to bother the people who were enjoying something. So I said, so I had to retreat from life to fiction. And here, this is my last line of defense. If I start being considerate inside my stories, I will have no place in the world where I can express my arbitrary wishes. And she was quiet for a few seconds, and she said, actually, I find this good answer, and hung up. And I was glad to hear that actually there were quite a few religious schools that found it okay to tell a story about a kid and his relationship with a piggy bank, even though a pig is not a kosher animal.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I won't even ask what they think about Charlotte's Web over in Israel, but never mind. So I want to wrap up. I want to thank everybody for joining us, of course, this morning, our audience. What an incredible conversation, an incredible mix of narratives, stories, and the way that our community can do whatever we can to lend a hand to our brothers and sisters in Israel to promote education, to promote literacy, to promote writing. Of course, I want to thank our lay leader, Karen Perlmutter, who's with us, who, her own personal background obviously weaves together similar to Etgar's background and ties it up with the ICEI and the work that we can do with Don. So I want to thank everybody, Etgar, Don, Karen, and of course our whole team that's behind us that helped make today's program happen. A few last little pieces of information coming in the chat box. And one final reminder, if you haven't done so already, please sign up. We'll send you one of these books. You'll get to hear some more amazing stories similar to Mayan and Avishag. So we want to get this to you as soon as we can. So with that, Don, thank you so much. Etgar, what a pleasure. Thank you. Karen, thank you. Have a good rest of the day, everybody, and good night in Israel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.